Have you ever fantasized about residing in the Middle Ages? Envision knights adorned in shining armor, grand castles, and perhaps a time less complicated? Well, it's time to set aside those dreamy ideas, because we're about to pull the medieval welcome mat right from under your feet. We've discovered 33 everyday realities from that period that are so utterly strange, so comically unhygienic, and so profoundly peculiar, you'll find yourself grateful for the conveniences of indoor plumbing and Wi-Fi. Brace yourself for a historical journey into the downright absurd. First up, an unbelievable tale that's a genuine gem of medieval insanity. Imagine this: Erfurt, Germany in the year 1184. King Henry VI convenes a significant assembly known as a Hoftag, essentially a medieval VIP gathering. All the notable nobles, bishops, and dignitaries are crammed into the upper section of a structure at St. Peter's Monastery. They're likely deliberating profoundly serious medieval matters, such as who boasts the pointiest hat or where their next conquest should be. Then crash. Please do like, subscribe to our channel, and comment below with your location. The entire wooden floor, burdened with the weight of noble egos and armor, gives way. And where do they end up? Directly into the monastery's latrine pit, the cesspool, the colossal medieval toilet. We're talking about dozens of Germany's elites submerged in actual human waste. Reports suggest that around 60 prominent figures met their incredibly undignified fate, suffocating in centuries' worth of accumulated well you can imagine. The king himself merely escaped because he was seated in an alcove on a stone floor. Can you fathom the odor, the chaos, the sheer embarrassment for those who almost succumbed? Talk about a terrible way to be remembered in history, quite literally. So, you find yourself in medieval Europe contemplating, maybe having our 15th child isn't the greatest idea at this moment. Considering the plague and everything, what are your contraception methods? Well, forget about science, as it was predominantly preoccupied with counting how many angels could dance atop a pin. Instead, you'd resort to some truly outrageous folk remedies. How about donning an amulet crafted from a dried toad? Yes, a toad dangling from your neck? Or perhaps you'd prefer inserting a pessary made of, wait for it, crocodile waste. That's right, actual crocodile droppings carefully placed. Other popular alternatives included weasel testicles because obviously, or consuming potions made from willow bark, which, okay, has some scientific basis related to aspirin. But there were no clinical trials underway. The sheer desperation, and let's admit, the gag-inducing quality of these strategies only highlight how vastly different their understanding of the human body was. A romantic evening, darling, just let me fetch my toad and dung. Thirdly, prior to Netflix, HBO, and even basic cable, what did people do for thrilling amusement? Well, if you were in medieval Europe, you'd gather the children, pack a lunch, and head to the town square to witness a public execution. Seriously, these weren't somber secret affairs. They were grand public spectacles, the blockbuster events of their time. People would trek for miles, vendors would peddle food and drink, and securing a prime spot with a clear view of the chopping block or gallows was highly coveted. It was part social gathering, part moral lesson supposedly, and entirely grisly entertainment. Just picture the frenzy. This Friday, don't miss Thomas the Traitor facing execution by drawing and quartering. Fun for the entire family. It's akin to Netflix and Kill, but with actual killing and significantly worse snacks. And you thought your reality television was intense? Fourthly, do you think your legal system is strange? Hold my ale. In medieval times, it wasn't only humans who found themselves in court. Oh no. Animals had their day under the law as well. We're discussing actual formal trials for creatures both great and small. Pigs were notoriously frequent defendants, often accused of killing children. And yes, they could indeed be found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging or burning, sometimes even dressed in human attire for the occasion. But it didn't end there. Rats, weevils, locusts, even flies, and caterpillars were brought to trial for ruining crops or being general nuisances. They were assigned court-appointed lawyers, witnesses were summoned, and if deemed guilty, they might be excommunicated by the church or ordered to vacate the town. Imagine an attorney passionately arguing, "My client, Sir Reginald Roach, was only seeking sustenance." It's completely absurd, yet it reveals a world where the boundaries between human and animal sin, as well as crime, were intriguingly blurred. Fifthly, let's dive into the ultimate medieval multi-tool, often referred to as the golden elixir. Not exactly a magical potion, but certainly golden in color. I'm referring to urine. Yes, urine. Ah, the good old number one. In a time bereft of advanced chemistry, aged urine turned out to be surprisingly beneficial, primarily due to its ammonia content. Looking to make your linens shine bright white? Ditch the bleach. Instead, soak them in stale urine. This practice was a common laundering technique. Have some tough animal hides needing softening for leather? Urine was right there on the job for tanners. Some even purported that it served as an excellent antiseptic for wounds, although I would likely prefer to take my chances with a bit of dirt. Thank you. There are even stories of its usage as a mouthwash for brighter teeth, which may lean more towards Roman customs. However, the principle of ammonia as a cleanser was well recognized. So the next time you grumble about household chores, just be thankful you don't have to gather the family's contributions for laundry day. The original eco-friendly solution, if you will. 6. The grandiose medieval castle filled with knights, dragons, fair maidens, and toilets that would send a modern health inspector into a frenzy. Enter the garderobe. Sounds quite fancy, doesn't it? Almost like a walk-in closet for your robes. At times it was situated near clothing storage because the ammonia fumes from the deposits below were thought to keep moths at bay. Quite clever. However, the garderobe itself was fundamentally a stone or wooden seat equipped with a hole extending out from the castle wall. And where did all that waste go? Straight down. Plop into the moat if fortune favored you, or directly onto the ground below if luck did not shine. Imagine being a soldier attempting to scale the castle walls, only to have an unfortunate surprise land on you from above. Talk about a unique form of biological warfare. Privacy was scarce. Toilet paper, a handful of hay moss, or if you were particularly well off, a scrap of cloth. The unsweet nightmare indeed. Truly the pinnacle of medieval convenience. 7. Picture yourself living in the Middle Ages. You've just wrapped up a hard day's work or whatever constituted a tough day back then. That certainly didn't involve mindlessly scrolling through social media. You're likely feeling a tad grimy. Time for a nice hot shower. Good one. Bathing, as we would consider it today, was an infrequent luxury and sometimes even regarded with suspicion. For many, a full body wash might occur only a handful of times a year, if that. Public bathhouses existed. Indeed. But they often gained a reputation for being, shall we say, dens of iniquity. Some physicians even believed that hot water opened your pores to disease, that infamous miasma or foul air. So, people largely relied on a quick splash of water for their hands and faces. The general scent of a medieval town or a packed space, let's just say it was quite robust. Imagine your annual Christmas bath was a notable occasion. Suddenly, that slightly musty odor in your gym bag doesn't seem so troublesome, does it? 8. Following the rare bathing habits, how did medieval folks manage the omnipresent stench of unwashed bodies, questionable sanitation, and all things medieval? Did they have access to some magical super-strength body spray? Not quite. Their remedy was far more floral. Quite literally. People carried posies, small bunches of fragrant flowers and herbs, or pomanders, which were little balls filled with aromatic substances like ambergris. Musk or spices often stored in ornate metal containers. The idea wasn't to eliminate unpleasant smells and near impossible feat, honestly, but rather to create a personal bubble of slightly less offensive air surrounding their noses. Imagine a noble lady delicately inhaling her posy while walking through a crowded market, or a gentleman holding his pomander high in a stuffy hall. It's a charming image until you realize they were doing it to avoid gagging on the odor of everyone, including themselves. A salute to their fragrant little hearts for trying. 9. Now let's discuss smiles in the Middle Ages. Or rather, the often alarming lack of them, because dental care was, to put it mildly, medieval. If you suffered from a toothache, your choices were quite dismal. You could attempt to rinse your mouth with wine, which, at least for a moment, made the pain feel somewhat more distant. Or you could pray fervently. Street. Apollonia was the saint for dental woes, and people would beseech her for relief. If divine intervention and alcohol did not help, your next stop was frequently the local barber-surgeon. Remember those individuals? The ones who specialized in haircuts and amputations. They also played the role of dentists. Their primary tool? A fearsome pair of pliers and a sturdy arm? Anesthesia. That was for the faint-hearted, or more accurately, virtually non-existent. They would simply yank that troublesome tooth out. You would really hope they selected the correct one and that you didn't succumb to any resulting infections. Suddenly, a root canal begins to sound like a luxurious spa experience, doesn't it? Imagine settling down for a hearty feast from the medieval ages. Succulent roasted meats, overflowing tankards filled with ale, and no actual plates to speak of. Well, not in the way we know them today. Instead, you often received a trencher. What exactly is a trencher, you might be wondering? It was essentially a thick, flat piece of stale bread, typically a few days old, which made it nice and sturdy. You would pile your food onto this edible plate, allowing the bread to absorb all the delightful juices and fats from your meal. Simply delightful. Once you finished the main dish, you had a decision to make. If you were still craving more, you could eat your trencher. Talk about environmental consciousness. If you were feeling generous or perhaps just full, you might offer your gravy-soaked bread plate to someone less fortunate, or throw it to the dogs eagerly waiting beneath the table. It's a brilliantly efficient system, truly. No cleaning up, just more eating or some thoroughly pleased hounds. Still, I do wonder about the structural stability of a really soggy trencher. Water during the Middle Ages was quite similar to playing Russian roulette with your digestive health. Rivers were frequently open sewers. Wells could be tainted. A sip from an incorrect source could result in a week filled with regret over every life choice you'd ever made. Or worse. So what did prudent medieval people drink instead? Alcohol, lots and lots of it. Ale and wine were the beverages of preference for nearly everyone, including children. Yes, little Timmy likely sipped on a weak ale with his morning meal. It wasn't about getting intoxicated, though that certainly occurred. It was primarily a matter of safety. The process of fermentation eliminated many of the harmful bacteria that made water so hazardous. Therefore, the phrase "water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink" was a rather literal truth, unless you preferred it fermented and mildly intoxicating. Cheers to survival. Spices during the Middle Ages were immensely valuable, akin to gold, pepper, cloves, nutmeg. These items were incredibly costly, transported across vast distances, and served as real status symbols. If your host sprinkled some exotic spice on your meal, you knew they were quite wealthy. However, beyond merely flaunting their riches, these precious spices had one more, somewhat less glamorous purpose: to disguise the flavors of food that was, shall we say, no longer fresh. Refrigeration wasn't really available, and meat in particular had a tendency to become somewhat funky, perhaps too ripe, or even, oh dear, is that odor supposed to be there? A generous sprinkle of potent spices could help mask those undesirable flavors, making a questionable cut of mutton suddenly become almost edible. So the next time you savor a heavily spiced dish, just take a moment to reflect on whether your ancestors were culinary innovators or merely excellent at concealing the taste of impending food poisoning. When Friday arrives, and if you're a devout medieval Christian, it means no meat, only fish. But what if you're far from the ocean, or simply yearning for something more substantial than a lackluster trout? Enter the beaver. Yes, the diligent dam-building beaver. You might assume a beaver is just a furry animal, clearly not a fish. However, you aren't considering the ecclesiastical logic of medieval times, because the beaver boasts a flat, scaly tail and spends a considerable amount of time in water. Some very astute and presumably beaver-craving church scholars declared that its tail and sometimes even its hindquarters qualified as fish. Problem solved. You could enjoy a savory beaver tail and still adhere to religious dietary laws. It's an amusingly convenient loophole, demonstrating that when there's a will and a hungry congregation, there's a way to entirely reclassify an animal. Picture your neighborhood barbershop. Pleasant chairs, sparkling mirrors, perhaps a few magazines. Now envision that same barber after providing you with a tidy haircut and a shave, casually inquiring if you would like him to address that bothersome bladder stone, or perhaps perform some bloodletting to relieve your fever. Welcome to the realm of the barber-surgeon. These versatile individuals weren't just trimming hair, they were conducting minor surgical procedures, extracting teeth, setting bones, and, of course, the ever-popular bloodletting. They were the backbone of medieval medicine, especially for those who couldn't afford the services of a physician trained at a university. The red and white striped barber's pole is said to symbolize blood and bandages. Thus, you could receive a short back and sides while potentially contracting a life-threatening infection, all in one convenient and likely very chatty locale. What an incredible service! 5. Have a headache, feeling a little low, caught the plague, bubonic or otherwise. Don't worry, for the medical practices of the medieval era had a universal remedy for nearly all your ailments: bloodletting. The belief rooted in the ancient concept of the four humors suggested that an excess of blood was to blame for most diseases. So naturally, the answer was to let some of it go. Barber-surgeons or physicians would eagerly bring out a lancet or use some ravenous leeches and out it would flow. How much would they draw? Well, that varied. Sometimes just a little, sometimes quite a bit. Did it actually work? Almost certainly not for the majority of ailments. And it likely left many individuals weaker and more vulnerable to, actually kicking the bucket. But hey, it was an activity, and it seemed very medical and significant. Feeling a tad off, mate? Let's just drain a pint or two. You'll be right as rain or well dead, one or the other. 5. If you think your quirky aunt with her crystals and essential oils is eccentric, you haven't encountered the medieval quack doctor. These figures wandered the countryside, promising miraculous remedies for issues ranging from baldness to demonic possession, often employing ingredients that would likely make a modern pharmacist weep. How about a sprinkle of mummy powder? Yes, genuine ground-up Egyptian mummies for your ailments. Or maybe a bit of unicorn horn, which was typically narwhal tusk to fend off poison. Animal dung powdered gemstones and strange herbal mixtures brewed under a full moon while reciting incantations backwards. Nothing was too bizarre if it marketed a cure. Many of these practitioners were charismatic showmen, far more interested in your wallet than your well-being. Their treatments were often ineffective, sometimes hazardous, and usually outrageously repugnant. It makes you appreciate a straightforward aspirin, doesn't it? 5. Think your dinner parties have uncomfortable moments. Imagine attending a medieval feast where the table etiquette would make a hyena blush, spitting on the floor. Completely acceptable in numerous circles as long as you avoided aiming for someone of importance. Loudly burping after a satisfying meal was often seen as a compliment to the cook. Wiping your oily hands on the tablecloth or even on your own attire if a dog wasn't around to clean them up. Sure, why not? And speaking of canines, they were often welcome guests beneath the table, eagerly snapping up any bones or remnants you generously tossed their way. Sharing a communal drinking cup with several individuals, some of whom might have suspect dental hygiene or a persistent cough. Just standard practice. It was a free-for-all of bodily functions and mingled germs. Suddenly, that cousin who double dips the chips doesn't seem so bad. 5. We've discussed garter robes, those charming castle toilets. But who indeed had the rather glamorous task of cleaning out all those latrines, cesspits, and privy vaults, especially in towns and cities? Enter the gong farmer or nightman. This was undoubtedly one of the worst, stinkiest, and most revolting jobs in the medieval period. These brave or perhaps just desperate individuals worked overnight, hence the name nightman to remove the amassed human waste. They'd shovel it into carts and haul it away, usually to dispose of it outside the city limits or sell it as fertilizer. The compensation was sometimes decent because, well, who else would undertake the task? However, the social stigma and the sheer olfactory assault must have been overwhelming. Imagine their Tinder profile. Gong farmer enjoys long nights, fresh air when possible, and avoiding discussing work. A truly honorable, albeit utterly revolting profession. 5. So you found yourself accused of a crime in medieval times. You insist on your innocence, but there's no video evidence, no DNA proof, just your word against theirs. How do you demonstrate your innocence? Why? Through a trial by ordeal, of course. This essentially involved asking God to perform a little miracle to show you were being truthful. Common methods included carrying a red-hot iron bar a certain distance. Your hand would be bandaged, and if after several days it was healing nicely without any festering, then huzzah! God had pronounced you innocent. If it turned into an unsightly pus-filled mess, well, you were guilty and probably about to lose your hand anyway. Another popular choice was trial by water, where you'd be thrown into a river with your hands tied. If you sank, you were innocent but likely drowned. That was indeed somewhat disadvantageous. If you found yourself floating, the water being pristine would reject you, indicating guilt. It was a scenario that offered benefits to absolutely no one involved. Perhaps only the onlookers. High fashion entails suffering, my dear. This was especially evident with medieval footwear, notably the caus or pulanes. These were shoes with absurdly elongated pointed toes. We're not discussing merely an extra inch or two. We're referencing points that could reach sow inches a foot, or even for the truly fashion-savvy nobleman, up to high feet beyond the actual toes. Picture attempting to walk. let alone maneuver through bustling medieval streets or, heaven forbid, stairs whilst wearing such contraptions. It was so impractical that the points were sometimes stuffed with moss or whalebone to maintain their form, or even tethered to the wearer's knees to prevent tripping over their own splendor. The church denounced them as devilish talons and emblems of vanity. Naturally, this only fueled their appeal among the defiant youth. Envision a medieval father. You will not leave the house in shoes that pointy, my son. Hi. While men flaunted their stylish pointy footwear, noble women aspired to new heights with their headdresses, specifically the hennin. This was a tall, conical or steeple-shaped hat often accompanied by a flowing veil. Imagine a fairy tale princess, but with some serious aerodynamic issues. Some hennins could measure 1 foot high feet or even feet high. They served as a significant status symbol. The taller your hat, the greater your rank, presumably. But think about the practical challenges. Navigating through an average medieval doorway. Good luck with that. You'd either need to master an incredibly deep curtsy-like bow, tilt your head at a precarious angle, or simply accept that your elaborate hat was destined to endure a few knocks. Knights might have had an easier time jousting than a lady donning a hennin would have had traversing a crowded ballroom. Doorways 1, hennins 0. Typically. Marriage in medieval times. A delightful union between two souls brought together by land, wealth, and strategic alliances. Love and romance were charming additions if they occurred, but certainly not the key motivations for the majority of noble or affluent families. Marriages were frequently arranged while the bride and groom were still children, sometimes even infants, to secure property, consolidate power, or establish peace treaties. The young couple might not even lay eyes on each other until their wedding day. It was less about, "Will you marry me?" and more like, "Our attorneys have prepared the prenup, please sign here." For commoners, there may have been a touch more personal choice. But financial security and ensuring the survival of the family farm or trade remained the utmost priority. So, if you're feeling anxious about your dating app matches, consider yourself fortunate that you aren't being bartered for a couple of prize-winning pigs and an acre of land. Hi. In today's society, personal space is deeply valued. We have our own bedrooms, to our own beds. In the Middle Ages, that was not the case. For many families, especially peasants, everyone squeezed into a single bed or on a communal sleeping platform for warmth. We're talking parents, children, perhaps a visiting relative, and quite possibly a few friendly farm animals like chickens, or even a piglet if it was especially chilly. Imagine the snoring, the kicking, the fleas. Oh, those fleas. Privacy was an alien notion. If you were a guest at a castle or inn, you might find yourself sharing a bed with complete strangers. It was all rather cozy in a sardines in a can kind of way, filled to the brim with livestock and parasites. Makes that lumpy mattress at your in-laws' house seem like a luxurious resort, doesn't it, Hi? Home sweet home. In the Middle Ages, often referred to home, smoky, dimly lit, and slightly damp abode. Most peasant dwellings were modest, 1 or 2 room huts generally featuring thatched roofs, wattle and daub walls, and dirt floors. Windows were minimal, typically just unglazed openings with wooden shutters to shield against the worst of the weather and likely inquisitive squirrels. Central heating consisted of an open hearth situated in the center of the room, with the smoke ideally escaping through a hole in the roof or in poorly attached gable. More often it simply filled the room, leaving everything and everyone coated in a fine layer of soot and perpetually smelling of wood smoke. Fresh air was something you only encountered outside. Indoors, it was a fragrant medley of smoke, unwashed individuals, cooking aromas, and perhaps a whisper of nearby livestock. Ah, the rustic allure. Hi, forget incognito mode. In a medieval village or town, everyone was well aware of everything pertaining to you. Your affairs were public knowledge. The absence of privacy was astounding by contemporary benchmarks. Homes were packed closely together, walls were flimsy, and individuals spent a significant portion of their time outdoors or within shared areas. Your romantic interests, the meal you enjoyed for dinner, your recent disagreement with your partner, that awkward skin condition you developed, it's likely your neighbors were thoroughly informed. Gossip served as a primary source of leisure and information sharing. If you engaged in anything scandalous, the entire community would be aware even before you had completed the act. It resembled existing in a reality television show that you never consented to, where everyone enjoyed prime seating and held rather strong opinions. In the snug, suffocating realm of medieval society, no secrets were safe. 26. Prior to germ theory, before the advent of X-rays, and before WebMD turned everyone into hypochondriacs, the understanding of medicine revolved around the theory of the four humors. This ancient Greek concept, which endured through the Middle Ages, suggested that the human body comprised four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your well-being and character were influenced by the equilibrium of these humors. An excess of blood rendered you sanguine, cheerful, and optimistic. An overabundance of phlegm made you calm, perhaps a touch lethargic. A surplus of yellow bile could make you choleric, fiery, and irritable. In contrast, too much black bile would leave you melancholic, sorrowful, and introspective. Illness was perceived as a disorder of these humors, and treatments, such as bloodletting or the recommendation of specific foods, aimed to restore harmony. It was a wonderfully oversimplified approach that bore no scientific validity whatsoever, yet remarkably, it persisted for over 1,000 years. 27. Think modern football or soccer is a rigorous sport. You haven't witnessed anything quite like medieval football. This wasn't a game characterized by refined footwork and tactical passes. It was frequently a frenzied, violent clash involving entire communities. The ball might have been an inflated pig's bladder, or in certain cases something even more gruesome. What rules? The aim was typically to maneuver the ball to a designated landmark, often miles away, through any means available. This would involve a massive scramble of individuals kicking, punching, clawing, and trampling one another. Fractures were common, serious injuries were frequent, and fatalities were not unheard of. It was less of a sport and more akin to an organized riot with a vaguely spherical object. Kings occasionally attempted to prohibit it, as it distracted from archery practice, a far more militarily advantageous pastime. Yet the populace adored their brutal village chaos. 28. Within the stringent hierarchy of the medieval court, speaking out against those in power was a surefire method of losing your head. Unless, of course, you were the court jester. These jesters, often clad in colorful attire with bells adorning their hats, held a distinctive privilege to mock, satirize, and criticize everyone, including the king himself. They utilized humor, riddles, and outrageous antics to illuminate uncomfortable realities, or the absurdities of court life, all presented under the veil of entertainment. A skilled jester was clever, quick-thinking, and had a profound understanding of human behavior. They were the original stand-up comedians and political satirists, delicately navigating the line between humor and offense. It was a perilous career. A poorly received joke from a sensitive monarch could still result in severe repercussions. However, for those who excelled, they were among the few who could genuinely roast the king and live to recount the story. 29. We currently inhabit a world primarily governed by science and verifiable truths. Yet, in the Middle Ages, the boundary between reality and fantasy was considerably more indistinct. For your average peasant and even numerous nobles, dragons weren't merely mythical beings. They were a potential, albeit uncommon, menace. Griffins, those stunning eagle-lion hybrids, were entirely believable. Sea monsters lurking in the unexplored seas. Absolutely. These beings filled their maps, their narratives, and their trepidations. Bestiaries or books detailing beasts cataloged these fantastical creatures alongside real animals, such as lions and elephants, frequently mixing fact with fiction. It wasn't that they lacked intelligence. It was a world with extensive uncharted territories where strange myths returned from distant lands and where the supernatural was an accepted element of daily life. Therefore, if you heard an odd sound outside your village during the night, if you happen to hear an unusual sound coming from outside your village during the night, you might honestly wonder if it was a wolf lurking around or perhaps a griffin on the hunt for a meal. Got an issue? In medieval times, there existed a saint to address that concern. Seriously. For nearly every imaginable ailment, vocation, or unfortunate situation, there was a particular patron saint you could beseech for assistance. Misplaced your keys? Call upon Street Anthony of Padua. Suffering from a sore throat, Street Blah One was your go-to person. Fearful of lightning strikes, Street Barbara had your back. There existed saints for brewers, saints for travelers, and even saints for those suffering from dental pain. Once again, Street Apollonia, and there were even saints designated to safeguard against rats and mice. This constituted a highly specialized celestial support system. This devotion to the saints offered solace and a sense of control amidst a world filled with uncertainty and peril. Moreover, it provided a specific entity to blame when things went awry. Street Anthony, I've been praying for an entire week. Where are my darn keys? Think the concept of fashion policing is a modern development. Think again. Medieval society enforced sumptuary laws, which were essentially regulations regarding what one could and couldn't wear based on their social standing and economic means. These laws dictated the types of fabric, hues, furs, and even the extent of embellishment permitted for different social ranks. A peasant donning luxurious velvet or flaunting excessive embroidery would be viewed as scandalous. That extravagance was meant for the nobility. The intention was to uphold social order and prevent commoners from overstepping their societal boundaries. The penalties for violating these fashion regulations could range from monetary fines to the confiscation of prohibited garments or even public humiliation. So, if you were a medieval merchant who suddenly struck it rich, you couldn't simply waltz into a shop and purchase the flashiest attire. You had to dress according to your legally established status in society. Talk about a real downer for your shopping escapade. Apologies, sir, but that man's ensemble is reserved for barons only. Off with your tunic. Medieval law books were treasure troves filled with bizarre yet fascinating specifics. Certainly there were laws against murder and theft, but then there were the truly peculiar ones. For instance, in certain regions of England, it was reportedly against the law to sing an ugly carol during the Christmas season. A real crime against festive joy. Curiously, there were regulations dictating the length of a dagger a man could carry. Additionally, laws determined when and where one could engage in dice or tennis games, often forbidden for the lower classes, lest it distract them from their labor or archery practice. In some locales, it was mandatory for men to engage in archery practice on Sundays. Just imagine being fined for not being proficient enough at holiday decorating or for skipping your weekend bow and arrow training. It clearly illustrates that medieval lawmakers had plenty of time on their hands and some distinct ideas about how society should operate. No smartphones, no internet, no 500 channels of cable television. How on earth did people in the Middle Ages pass the time and entertain themselves? Well, for the nobility there was hunting, hawking, and tournaments. For everyone else, the options became a bit more rustic. Village festivals were monumental affairs, often involving excessive amounts of ale feasting, dancing, and games that could become quite rowdy. Think less organized athletics. More chaotic brawls. Animal-centered entertainment was also regrettably popular. Bear baiting, where a chained bear was unleashed upon dogs. Or fighting were common displays. People gambled with dice, engaged in board games like chess and backgammon, or their medieval counterparts listened to itinerant minstrels. And certainly indulged in the age-old activity of gossip. It was a realm where you created your own amusement, often fueled by a considerable amount of alcohol and a carefree attitude toward animal welfare or personal safety. Count me in. So the Middle Ages were characterized by less glamorous fairy tales and more situations that made you say, "Hold my ale," and watch this complete disaster unfold. After trudging through that series of historical calamities and genuinely mind-boggling daily grind, here's the million-dollar inquiry. What is the one solitary medieval norm we've uncovered today that not only makes you feel uncomfortable, but has you racing back to the 21st century, exceedingly thankful for Wi-Fi, antibiotics, and basic hygiene? I want your most visceral choice, one that makes you think I'd rather wrestle a plague-ridden badger in the comments below. If this exploration into glorious historical madness made your mind tingle or your stomach turn, smash that like button. Share this with anyone who still idealizes the past, and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss another thrilling excursion into unbelievable truths they conveniently neglected to teach you. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.